Josh Ober, as most of you will know, is the Constantine Mitsotakis Chair in the Stanford University School of Humanities and Sciences, and particularly relevant for our purposes, he is the founder and faculty director of the Stanford Civics Initiative. And what has to blow everyone's mind, and it blows everyone's mind when I tell them this, is that the Stanford Civics Initiative has established a required civics course for first-year students at Stanford with the same syllabus taught across 75 sections. And so whatever you think about the exact syllabus, that's an astonishing accomplishment. And it ties into some of our discussion this morning about kind of a standardized curriculum versus an a la carte curriculum, how that would happen, strengths and weaknesses. So that's one of many reasons why he's an appropriate speaker today. Ober is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he serves on the Executive Committee of the Alliance for Civics in the Academy, an organization you should certainly look up their website, and you might want to be part of it, and they have a ton of great resources on their website. He will be speaking to us today about in effect, a talk related to his most recent book with Brook Manville, The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives. And so with that said, I'll turn things over to Professor Ober. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And if anybody needs to get a car service from South Bend, Indiana to Columbus, Ohio, blue and gold transport is your service. They got me here faster than I could have imagined. Trying to get right into it. The problem, I think, at least one of the problems that we face today is that democracy is not doing as well as it ought to be doing here in the United States, nor in the rest of the world. And one of the underlying problems, not the only one, but one underlying problem is political polarization. Political polarization tends to lead to, or can lead to, what I'm going to call the Schmittian moment. This introduces you, some of you will already know, the work of Carl Schmitt, a leading jurist in the Nazi regime in Germany in the mid-20th century, and subsequently a writer on political theory, political philosophy. Key terms in Schmitt's vocabulary are political theology and the friend-enemy distinction. We'll talk a little bit more about that. John McCormick, University of Chicago, years ago, 1998, wrote about Schmitt upon the publication of some of Schmitt's work in English. And he said, the sage of the left and the right in post-war Europe, Carl Schmitt is fast becoming recognized as the 20th century's foremost critic of liberalism. And this is one of the striking things, that Schmitt, an acknowledged Nazi, was both taken up by people on the far left and the far right, and by serious intellectuals in both cases. So I should admit, being a member of a political science department, that political science is a field that is much better at explanation than it is at prediction. When we try to predict outcomes, things like elections, it often goes bad. Political theorists don't even try to do prediction, right? That's not our job. And yet, here McCormick seemed to be saying, fast becoming. And this is one of the very rare times in which I think a political scientist, much less a political theorist, has been, in fact, prescient. For those of you who have used the Google Ngrams facility, or the program, it's fantastically interesting. It allows you to get simple counts of the names or words or phrases from all of English literature, basically, literature written in English, from roughly the 1800 to the present. Here we're only going from the 1970s to about 1920, but the point is obvious. In 1998, Schmitt was already becoming, as it were, more popular, was being cited more often. His terms, political theology, friend, enemy, were being used, but it's really gone up since there, and it's only increased since 2020, the most recent that Ngram is accurate. So, friend-enemy relationship means politics as an existential conflict between hostile factions. That's how Schmitt saw it. Politics is always a matter of hostility. The political theology for him is that politics, once again, or what he called the political, is a matter of good versus evil. So it is seen in these sense theological terms. This leads to a demand for perfection, right? If it's good versus evil, our side is good, they are evil. We're not going to try to find a common good that is shared by both sides. We're going to try to have our own perfected form of politics. And it leads to very high stakes political contests, right? It means if we're a battle of good versus evil, if this is friends versus enemies, it means the stakes are high. Winning is really profoundly important. Losing is a catastrophe. And so finally, it means that politics is seen as a zero-sum game. It's all about winning and losing, and winning means that my side gets everything, your side gets nothing, or vice versa, right? And that's the high stakes. So just a few quotes from Schmitt, those of you who haven't memorized his corpus. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives may be reduced is that between friend and enemy. So there's the friend-enemy relation. Political thought and political instinct prove themselves theoretically and practically in the ability to distinguish friend and enemy. The high points of politics are simultaneously the moments in which the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. Right? The friends, enemy, and combat concepts, another Schmitt notion, receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. So keep in mind, this guy was a leading jurist in the Nazi regime. And we know what killing meant when we've identified the enemy. All right, that's the Schmitt moment. And what I worry about is we're far from the kind of nightmares of Nazism, but the enemy is in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. And these are just random quotes taken up from recent political discussions, the recent election. And on both sides we get Trump, for example, calling his enemies vermin, and Kamala Harris calling Trump a fascist, and so on. The possibility of physical killing has, in fact, been manifest. Not only the possibility, but the reality. Existential negation of the enemy. Once again, this is shared on both sides. The various abolish the movements are really about eliminating, negating, rather than simply rethinking or in some ways limiting. War follows from enmity, and so once again, once we have real enmity on the table, you have to really be ready for, well, as Schmitt said, the possibility of killing. War is, after all, about killing. Non-negotiable demands for perfection, once again, on both sides of the divide. No way to compromise. It's got to be all the way. Raising the stakes of politics. Trump calls Biden the destroyer of politics. Bernie Sanders says it will be the end of democracy. So once again, the high stakes, if my side doesn't win, the world, or at least the political world, is going to be profoundly changed, overwhelmed, destroyed. Zero-sum thinking. Here, Donald Trump saying to his biographer, he's not interested in win-win deals, only in I-win outcomes. And when asked if he ever left anything on the table as a sign of goodwill so he might do business with the same party in the future, he said no and pointed out there are many people in the world he can work with one at a time. So, politics of zero-sum thinking. Bernie Sanders talking about a war being waged by the wealthiest and most powerful people against working families. And once again, Donald Trump, Mexican immigrants are taking our jobs, manufacturing jobs, they're killing us, right? So this is the language of zero-sum. Everything that one gets, the other one simply loses. All of this, I think, helps explain how democracies die, or at least how they may die, which is the subject of a lot of literature these days. Our question in the book that Brook Manville and I wrote was how democracy survives, at least survives for a long time, not forever necessarily, but for a long time when it actually does. So what we suggest is that long-lasting, successful democracies are not based on Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction. It doesn't reduce politics into friends and enemies. It doesn't reduce to zero-sum competition between sides in which one side wins it all and the other side loses it all, but rather long-lasting democracies are based on bargaining. For those of you who've done bargaining theory will recognize this is John Nash's Nobel Prize-winning solution to the bargaining problem. There's a lot of deep mathematics behind this. Please don't ask me to explain it. But I think it shows you just in simple scheme what a non-zero-sum bargaining solution is like. And here we're just calling it the elite share and the mass share. And the point is that the starting position of the negotiation here is going to be point P, right? And point P, if we think about each of these axes, are the share of some good, right? Political power, whatever it is. And so at point P, we can see that the elite on that dotted line has a somewhat better share than the mass. And the question is then, how can a negotiation make both sides better off? And how much better off can a negotiation make both sides? Well, the maximum payoff for both sides is the curve. That's called the Pareto frontier. That's when you've captured all the benefit that is available from cooperation. And we then have to just decide where on that curve, if we're going to maximize our returns in a negotiation, is it going to be? And that's going to be determined by the diagonal. The diagonal is simply defined by the bargaining power or bargaining strength on both sides. So in this simple diagram, the elite have some advantage to start with. They're getting a bigger share of whatever is being divided, and they have some superior bargaining strength, right? So they're going to get a better deal. If you draw the verticals and horizontals from point Q, you'll see, they'll have rather more than the mass. So it's not going to be perfectly equitable, but note, both are better off. Right? Both are better off within this bargain than they were at point P. And therefore, although, is it perfectly fair by anybody's point of view? No, probably not. But are both sides have a reason to make the bargain? Yes, they do, right? And it's absolutely not zero-sum. Both have gained, right? They're both further along than they had been. So that's the point. That's the bargaining solution. So what we do is suggest that there are various historical cases that enter into this kind of logic. Athens, Rome, Britain, the UK, and the US. And Brook Manville and I are both trained as historians. We know that these cases are very different. You get into the details, you get into the weeds, and you're going to say, oh, well, look at all of the ways in which they just are substantially not like each other. What we want to say is that 30,000 feet, or at a high enough level of generality, we can see some similar trends, right? So anyone who wants can say, well, hold it, but how about Rome isn't really like the UK? You're right. But maybe at some point it's similar enough in some ways for us to learn something. So that's just a caveat. So we're going to suggest that in our general argument that we see a pattern, and the pattern starts with political bargains struck between elites, between, for example, a king and the nobility, the clergy, and so on. These bargains, these initial political bargains, are meant to regulate inter-elite competition. Right? The king can do better if he negotiates with the nobles than if he has to fight the nobles all the time. So you cut a deal. So these initial political bargains then can, in some cases, lead to political concessions to non-elites. The king figures out, oh, well, I can get some advantage in my relationship with the nobles if I cut some of the towns in on the deal. I'll outsource some of the tax collecting to the towns, and they'll be my allies against the nobles. So we begin to bring in other players, once again, purely because the king wants to do better. Nobles can do likewise in their own way, and so on. These political concessions to non-elites can lead to non-elites becoming bargaining agents, right? The town people can say, okay, well, you'd want to get that much tax out of our deal. We'd like to have a little bit more, thank you. So now we're part of the bargain. And this, at least in a few cases, in the cases we're interested in, can lead to the development of a conception among the people in a given territory of being a people, like we the people, or the demos of Athens, or the populace of the Roman Republic. That is a socially diverse, self-authorized body that declare ourselves to be citizens rather than the subjects of some other external power, rejecting basically any final boss or bosses at the level of the ultimate political authority. So it doesn't mean there aren't any boss or bosses locally, but at the final political authority, we say no. We then need to codify our arrangement in some way, either by a written document, for example, the US Constitution, which I'll talk about a little bit more, or some sort of ritual, which we have some examples of from other places. And that's what we call the civic bargain. Okay? It's when the people, or when a people, have decided that the bargain they're going to make is with one another, not to be run by an external boss, but to only have themselves as the boss. Here's a famous example of it. We'll sort of do the American case, which is familiar, I believe. September 1787, end of the Constitutional Convention. Here's a story most of you heard, maybe apocryphal. Once again, don't hold me to the historicity of it. But Mrs. Elizabeth Powell, who's sometimes referred to as a society matron, she was actually a leading intellectual of Philadelphia who had a salon. There were reasons that she had Franklin's ear, assuming she did at this moment. Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? So basically this is it going to be self-government by citizens? or is it going to be ruled by a king or a tyrant or a dictator, a boss of some sort? And Franklin, famously to Mrs. Powell, a republic if you can keep it. And that, I think, was from Franklin both a promise, it will be, that's what we intend, a republic, and of course a warning. If you can't keep it, then the alternative is going to be a monarchy of some sort or the rule of a boss. Let me turn to a slightly less familiar moment in American constitutional history. This is Franklin's last speech on the floor of the convention after the final draft of the Constitution was in front of the delegates. And he has to decide, or the delegates have to decide to sign off or not. This is before the ratification debates. We're still inside. This is before he talks with Mrs. Powell. And Franklin, in his speech, actually not delivered by himself, but by James Wilson. Franklin was very ill by that time. But it is written by Franklin. And Franklin writes that he agreed to this Constitution with all its faults, if such they are, noting that there are several parts which I do not at present approve. And yet I consent because I'm not sure that this Constitution is not the best. The options I've had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good. And just pause for a moment in thinking of that. The errors, the opinions I've had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good. So Franklin's point is that the Constitution was not perfect. It was not perfect by Franklin's standards. Errors, or at least opinions he'd had of its errors. It's not perfect by the standards of any of the other delegates. Nobody was getting everything they wanted from this Constitution. It was a bargain, right? A bargain made among the delegates there. And it was and this is Franklin's point, the best available bargain. Right? That's why he's going to sacrifice his opinion about errors, because he thinks it is best in the sense of best available. And this then was a civic bargain, right? And so in a sense, this is a model civic bargain. So we can then begin to think about sort of abstracting for what do we get from this bargain? What are the conditions that make this bargain possible? Well, the bargain is meant to ensure that there is no overall boss. There's not going to be a king. There's not going to be a monarch, if you can keep it. So, for example, the scope of the president's authority was limited. There would be balance of powers, Bill of Rights to protect individuals, limiting the powers of the courts and the legislature as well. So this is famously what the Constitution was seeking to do, to avoid the concentration of power any place, and especially in the hands of any one individual. Second, it was essential that the bargain provide for the country's security and for its basic welfare. And in order to do that, they had to strengthen financial and military authority in a federal government. The Constitution, as you know, was put into place because of the failure of the former Articles of Confederation, which had too weak a central government. It was necessary to define who is a citizen and what that meant in terms of rights and duties. Now, citizenship is not defined in the Constitution as such, but each of the states did define who is a citizen, who has a vote, and the ratification would be by, as it were, the most democratic, the widest franchise possible in each of the states. Fourth, the delegates established procedural rules, that is, the basic institutions of government, and that's what we typically think about when we think about the Constitution. That's what it is. It's a set of procedural rules. But in order to do that, in order to set up those rules, they had to negotiate with one another in good faith. Negotiating in good faith doesn't mean you're delighted by the outcome. It doesn't mean that you're particularly happy with your fellow negotiators. But it does mean, and in fact they were able to negotiate in good faith, because the delegates at Philadelphia treated each other as civic friends rather than enemies. Now, civic friends, take the term from Aristotle, does not mean we particularly like each other necessarily. It's not, civic friends are not necessarily people I want to go out and have a beer with. But they are people that I have decided, I have determined that I am in some kind of an enterprise that I share with them, and therefore they are not my enemies, right? They are people that I have to be able to, negotiate with in good faith. I have to treat them that way. I have to have a disposition towards them that is not a disposition of just sheer enmity. And they could do that in turn, we argue, because they'd been educated in the essentials of civic life, both by their formal learning. They were all, or at least the great majority of them, deeply learned in political philosophy of the time, in political history, in classical antiquity. They were educated through their experience in the various colonial assemblies, and they were educated by one another in that state house in Philadelphia. They listened to each other. They gave these long speeches that were taken up, some of them recorded, at least in part by Madison. So they were actually learning from each other. They were learning at least what were the really deep interests that come from various sides. What are the preferences that are really strongly held? Where might there be some leeway for bargaining? So from this, we extract 7 basic conditions for democracy: no boss except one another, security and welfare, defined citizenship, citizen-led institutions, good faith negotiation, civic friendship, and civic education. And in a sense, we can do it from the top down, right? We start with the decision we don't want a boss, right? 1776. We're not going to be ruled by a king any longer. But we can also start from the bottom up and say, what do we have to do? What do we have to do if we want to keep a republic? And civic education, I'm going to argue, is the basis of everything as we work our way back up. Okay, so 4 historical cases: Athens, Rome, Britain, and the US. What we argue for, several sort of basic points, each one of them in some ways controversial. So with apologies to Thomas Hobbes, the great theorist of absolutism, we argue that getting and keeping security and welfare does not require a boss. You don't need a king or an oligarchy or a majoritarian tyranny in order to achieve basic safety and welfare. And we can show this historically. Athens, Rome, the US all developed into powerful, wealthy societies without ever turning over authority to an all-powerful ruler. Exactly what Hobbes thought you had to have in order to have a secure and wealthy society. Britain's parliament and rule of law incrementally constrained the power of the monarch through the parliament. Once again, Hobbes, of course, thought this was a scandal, an impossible. Divided power was a disaster. So we argue that simply Hobbes is wrong. Democracy of the sort we're talking about, collective self-government, is in fact possible and has been historically enacted. We argue that republic and democracy are compatible. These are not contradictory terms. It's not a binary choice. And I think we can show this with apologies to James Madison, who sort of did see an absolute distinction between republic and democracy, because we can show that Athens, the model ancient democracy, and Rome, the model ancient republic, both combine direct voting on policy by large citizen assemblies with representative councils, and both develop detailed legal systems that constrained popular decision-making. We can say this with some certainty that Madison is wrong about this simply because we know a lot more about Athens than Madison could have known, because there's a lot more documentary evidence that has emerged since then. So Madison was not being foolish when he said this, but we just are now able to make a better historical case. We argue that organized political parties are not essential features of all democratic republics, certainly are features of every modern democratic republic, but formal political parties were absent in both Athens and Rome. There were some factions, but they were nothing like what we think of as formal parties. And of course, the US Constitution never mentions political parties, is ignorant of political parties. First, organized American political parties emerge after the Constitution is established, fairly soon after, but still in all, it's not part of the structure of the Constitution. So once again, it's at least possible to imagine a world in which parties were not the primary feature of contemporary democratic politics. We argue that democracy requires a fundamental respect for certain rights, including freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. But we really emphasize that every right also comes with duties, with responsibilities. Responsibility falls on citizens rather than falling on the sovereign, right? And king's job to defend whatever rights there are. In a democracy, it's our job. It is the job of citizens. And defending rights is costly. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources. And that means that new rights should not be created just casually. The worry then is that multiplying rights indefinitely can ultimately degrade the defensive rights necessary for democracy, because citizens will begin or may begin to say, there's simply too much. The cost is too high. There are all of these rights of all of these different people or groups and so on that I'm expected to defend. And I just can't do it. And being able to just not do it might mean, in the end, that I'm not going to put in the energy that I think a democracy must put in to defend the essential rights of speech, assembly, conscience, at least. So what we argue that civic bargain among citizens is always preceded by political bargains among elites, and then among elites and non-elites. So one example of this historically is in Athens. Solon, the lawgiver in 594 BC, negotiated a bargain between the wealthiest Athenian landowners who had been in the process of simply enslaving their poorer neighbors, a negotiation between the wealthy and the poor who were at risk of being enslaved, falling into debt slavery. So the bargain that is negotiated, once again, it's a hard bargain. Neither side particularly was delighted with it. We know that from Solon's own poetry. He tells us, they were both mad at me at the end of it, which is good, because that means actually it was the best available bargain. If one side had been utterly delighted, the other side probably would have said, we're backing out of it. So this paves the way for Athenian democracy. In Rome, the famous struggle of the orders, a series of bargains between elite patricians and non-elite plebeians. The plebeians basically being completely cut out in early Rome of all political authority, and eventually becoming sufficiently fed up with being cut out that they say, we're not getting anything out of this. What's that sound in the distance? That would be the tramp, tramp of the feet of various of Rome's enemies coming towards us, planning to take us over. What do we care? We can be run by them rather than run by you awful patricians. And of course, the patricians at that point say, no, come on, let's be sensible here. How would you guys like a share in the consulship? And so on. Once again, struggle of the orders is indeed a series of bargains. Once again, hard bargaining. but hard bargaining in which both sides came off better than they would have without making the bargain. It's not zero-sum. In Britain, the Magna Carta, just one of many bargains between monarchs and barons and church leaders and townsmen. The history of the UK is just a history of a series of these bargains. So we argue that scale is absolutely essential. We have to think about scale when we're moving from Athens or Rome to modernity. And increasing scale, we suggest, is both the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge that is faced by a democracy. So we can think of scale in terms of being more people. So the rise of the population of the US since 1790. We can also think about it as increasing diversity, and diversity in all kinds of ways. So this is a map of racial diversity, but that's not the only one you should be thinking about. You should think about religious diversity or economic diversity or all kinds of others, ways in which people distinguish themselves from one another. So scale is an opportunity because more citizens with diverse skills, with diverse experiences, can increase the security and welfare of a state when that state faces various hostile rivals. So basically, what can happen is we just get more information, more knowledge into the solution space because we have a much broader, as it were, base of people who are contributing to the solution space. Dictatorships have this weakness in which that they tend to be a small bubble around the leader who is going to tell him what? You know, oh, fearless leader, everything's going wonderfully. Chairman Mao, no problem at all with the food supplies out there in the provinces, and therefore, as I'm sure you know, the Great Famine of China. So democracies can avoid that and have tended to. But scale is a challenge because more citizens with diverse interests and preferences over policy outcomes makes good faith bargaining more difficult. Right? We have more people at, in the sense, the bargaining table, and they're bringing different interests, preferences, and it may be just harder for us to recognize that, yeah, these are civic friends, don't like them much, but we're going to negotiate with them. They're not enemies. We're part of a common enterprise. That gets harder. And so both opportunity and challenge. Well, I want to sort of conclude here thinking about civic education, the role of civic education, which I really see as sort of the foundation of our whole story. As I said, you work up from the bottom to get to the as it were, no-boss outcome. And what I would suggest is that if we think of the world of the very closed world of the delegates in Philadelphia in 1787 as a world of mutual education, learning from each other, so too immediately after that, in the ratification debate, the education had to be, as it were, extended. Right? So the Federalist Papers, of course, a series of op-eds, mostly in the New York papers, and then responded to by the anti-Federalists, who never collected theirs into a volume, but it's been done now. And both sides were basically trying to educate a public that would end up voting for or against the new Constitution, try to make arguments and reasoned arguments for why this was a good idea, Federalists, or a bad idea, the anti-Federalists. So the whole constitutional story starts out with a deep sort of, as it were, necessity of entering into education. So there's a long and interesting history of civic education in the United States through the 19th century. And if we had hours, we could talk about that, but you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to do that. I'm going to jump ahead to the early part of the 20th century, to a place I know reasonably well, Stanford University. And in 1920, Stanford inaugurated a course, a year-long course for all citizens, or all students rather, all first-year students, called Problems of Citizenship. What we're seeing here on the slide is a one-page sketch of the original syllabus for this. We don't have a detailed syllabus, but this is in Princeton's, or in Stanford's archives. So the original director of citizenship called the course a preparation for citizenship as a problem in education. It was supposed to be what education was about. It was solving the problem of how do we have an educated citizen body, or at least insofar as Stanford students were part of that body. And the focus of the course was, it's really remarkably modern. It was problems of liberty and cooperation. And if you look at even the sketch syllabus, it's pretty clear that they saw that there's a tension here, right? You're free to do what you want, liberty, and yet we have to do things together, cooperation. They didn't have all of the complicated apparatus of game theory and so on in 1920, but they were thinking along those lines. So this gives you a sense of what it looked like in a few years after inauguration. All of the Stanford students, men and women alike, Stanford was founded as a co-educational institution, in a big lecture hall. Presumably, Professor Robinson was up in the front, like I'm up in front here, giving them a lecture about problems of citizenship. In the 1930s to 1980s, this basic course sort of morphs first into a course in Western civilization, then into Western culture, then into culture, ideas, and values, until finally in the 1980s, Western Civ has got to go, and it went. Indeed, all of the idea that Stanford was supposed to be engaged in some kind of an education of citizens, as well as the education of computer programmers, basically fell away, right? So that's it. It's too complicated. It's too controversial. We're just not going to do it. And yet, more recently, it's back. So just about 100 years after the first inauguration of Problems of Citizenship, we piloted a new citizenship course for first-year students. A lot of the work of getting this through the University Senate, and I am still amazed to be able to report that it was unanimously approved by the University Senate. A lot of that work is done by my colleague and friend Daniel Edelstein. Shout out to him. He really, really worked the room and did it very effectively. And in the background, the Stanford Civics Initiative, which I had founded some years before, that have been running ever since, was providing, as it were, the kind of support for the development of the syllabus, for rolling out beta testing of the syllabus. So we were ready to try to push behind it if we could get approval, which we then did in fact do. So in this year, Stanford has a quarter system rather than a semester system. So in the winter quarter this year, something over 1,200 Stanford freshmen took the course. This is 2/3 of the freshman class. We hope that we will pass. I would love it to be, again, unanimously through the Senate, the extension, so it's all of the freshmen will be taking this course. There's one shared syllabus. There were roughly 80 sections taught by 53 instructors, both faculty and postdoctoral fellows recruited for the purpose. And the class is defined by the way that the seminars are being taught, and I'm not talking about content now, which we could talk about. The syllabus is available on the Stanford Civics Initiative website, by the way. There's a whole listing of courses, and anyone interested can download the current syllabus. Anyway, it's defined by free speech, by mutual respect among students with very differing positions, as they come to find out. Viewpoint diversity, a reading of texts that give them very different takes on genuinely controversial questions that are before us. This is the 21st century, a citizenship course. And the idea is to work through together, have the students do a lot of the work themselves, a set of difficult topics. There's only one plenary session a year. This is the one from a few years back. This was the first time we had actually offered the course. We had no idea how the plenary session was going to go. Was it going to be more hey, hey, ho, ho? Or how was it going to be? But we thought we're going to lead with showing that, in fact, viewpoint diversity is real. So some of you will recognize Condoleezza Rice, the director of the Hoover Institution, now as then. Pamela Karlan, a leading, basically political theorist as well as legal scholar in Stanford Law School, and certainly on the left side of the spectrum. And in the middle, Jonathan Holloway, who is at that point the president of Rutgers University. And the point was, we wanted to show to students that you could take people and have a conversation in public by people who really disagree with each other on some very fundamental things, and yet who deeply agree with each other about other things. Not just that there should be a citizenship course, but about some of the content of the citizenship course, about the importance of institutions, and well-designed institutions, for example, which is what turned out to be one of the major topics that we discussed, not by prearrangement. They chose to come into that. I'm in the side waving my hands because I'm supposed to be moderating this discussion. So this is the Stanford Civics Initiative. I just put it up there. That's our website, and I encourage you to come visit the website to see what we're about, the courses that we offer, some of the people involved in the initiative. And this I want to particularly underline. This is the website for the Alliance for Civics in the Academy. The Civics Initiative is now divided, or as it were, mutually supported by the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford and by the Hoover Institution. They basically split the budget down the middle. What Hoover has been pushing, or the big part of the Hoover part of this whole initiative, is this Alliance for Civics in the Academy, aimed at being a network of instructors in civics, administrators, but especially those who are teaching. People who are at the coalface of actually delivering civic content. And the goal is to bring instructors from a whole range of different kinds of institutions, from red states and blue states, from public and private institutions, large and small, well-resourced and ill-resourced, together into a community of practice, by which we mean a community that is concerned with learning from each other. And we've started this in the hopes that there actually is a there for civic education in the United States. It is not a common curriculum to every college and every university. Far from it. This will be very different curricula. And yet, we think that it is at least possible to imagine that those engaged in civic education do have something to share, that they share some basic principles. What we ask the members of the Alliance, are something over 150 members now, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in this, if you'd like to join. There's no responsibilities to joining, although we hope there'll be some advantages to joining, to just simply drop me an email. We've kept it to be by nomination membership, basically because I wanted to keep the trolls out. At least in the beginning, because you have one of these things, you get people whose primary goal is to simply blow it up, and I didn't want to deal with that, at least until it was established. It's 3 months old, it's still pretty tender, so I think keeping the trolls out for a little longer might be a good thing. But it's been working remarkably well. We've already had 2 convenings, relatively small groups, but once again, from across the spectrum in various ways. And it's worked. It's worked better than I had really dared to hope. And it does seem that there is there. There can be an agreement on some basic principles. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So that's really it. There's an awful lot of energy at the moment, I think, behind civic education in the US, not only at colleges and universities, but in lots of non-government organizations. And it's coming from, both organizations that see themselves as on the left of the spectrum and organizations that see themselves on the right of the spectrum. There's a lot of ways to get involved in civic education. When I'm talking to groups that are not at universities, I basically say, what can you do? They're not at a university. Well, there's a wealth of things that you can do right now if you actually care about this agenda. So the core idea then is that civic education is what is the essential for a civic bargain. A civic bargain is the essential for democracy, and democracy means we govern ourselves instead of having a boss tell us what to do. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. So I'd really be delighted to take some questions. I've been told that you have to shout because there is not an audience microphone, so I'd be happy to hear from anybody who has a... Please, sir.
I'm wondering if you think that civic friendship and civic dialogue might be possible even among those who think that the other side does pose a dire threat to democracy, or do they need to give up that belief? If they need to give it up, are we in trouble? It's very entrenched. Abraham Lincoln said we must be friends, not enemies, in the first inaugural. That didn't work out. But he also thought that Southern slaveholders, that their beliefs did undermine the foundations of democracy, yet he still wanted to maintain friendship with them. So is that possible?
Yeah, I at least I believe it is. I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't. I like to think we are not at an 1860 moment. I like to think we're not at the point in which we have to kill each other in terrifying numbers, right? As you know, the Civil War was terrifying numbers in order to sort out our differences as citizens. So yes, you could see the other side as posing a threat, but if you think they're posing such a great threat that the only way forward is to exterminate them, to shut them up, to drive them out of the civic realm, then you'd better be ready for war. That's what Schmidt, I think, is right to say. You'd better be ready for the possibility of real killing. And I don't want to go there, and I hope no one in this room wants to go there. So I think that's the point. How dire a threat, if it's so dire that they have to be exterminated, then be prepared for war, or be prepared to give up democracy and say what we really need is a tyrant, the good kind of tyrant, who will indeed eliminate the other side. So we need a Lenin or a Mao, or somebody who will get rid of all the parasites who are infesting our world. Once again, obviously this is leading, but I think we really ought to say that even though I think there are certainly reasons for both sides in the current culture conflicts, I like to not say culture wars, you know, but really do have a lot of suspicion of each other, see each other as a threat. But if we can recognize this Aristotelian sort of civic friendship, right? We're just in this thing together. And it would be better to solve it in a way that we both get as much as we can through a negotiated agreement rather than resorting to the alternatives, which I think are pretty dire. Please.
Shared syllabus, common syllabus, if there are readings that generate a particular consensus or particular objection, either with faculty or students.
Yeah. No, so the question was about creating a core syllabus for a freshman course like this. And it's, once again, it is a matter of negotiation. I don't get my dream syllabus. I had my dream syllabus in a small course that I taught through about 40 students or so. So I thought that was a great course. And it was heavily historical. We did a lot of, fairly serious game theory. We did quite a lot of serious political philosophy. But, that was clearly not for 1,200 freshmen, many of whom are, on their way to become engineers or whatever. The advantage we had at Stanford is we were prepared once we got approval to go ahead with this large-scale course. We'd done our homework. We had really worked at the syllabus. We talked with a lot of people. We found over time, and this I think continues to be the case, that those who are willing to work hardest have a bargaining advantage. Bargaining strength in part is you just wait them out. You have better arguments, but you also make them longer and harder. So once again, that has proved to be, relatively, it gives us a bargaining. Do I get everything I want? No, but I would be sort of untrue to my principles if I demanded that I did get everything I want. Please, sir.
What your thoughts are on this in terms of the speed at which social media allows us to communicate, plus the fragmentation or silos of social media that occurs. How does that impact when you look at the bargaining aspect between the units?
No, social media, question, how does social media impact all of this is absolutely key. And I wish I were more adept at social media personally. Don't look for me on Facebook. You won't find me. Or on Instagram, much less on TikTok. So I think that is going to be really in the next generation working this forward. That's how we have to figure it out. We certainly have some preliminary attempts to deal with this. Many of the instructors say nobody is allowed to have any, as it were, phones, instruments in class. It has to be all completely face-to-face. But it's a huge challenge because it has tended to drive us collectively, a citizenship, into increasingly isolated bubbles. And we have to find ways, and I'm coming from Silicon Valley. That lot, has to find ways that it could be, that social media keeps us from I think the deep unhappiness of a Schmittian world. And I try to make one of the reasons for writing a book like this, try to get it out, is try to persuade people. Not only people who are already committed to the idea, yes, there should be civic education, the question is how should it be, but try to persuade people in Silicon Valley that you need to think seriously about the world that you are helping to make. And if you can't do something to avoid the Schmittian world, you will find yourself in that world, and that world may not be one that you moguls of Silicon Valley actually control. The pitchforks may turn out to be quicker and harsher and sharper than you think they actually will be. There was a question way in the back.
A question about social media, but more specifically about misinformation. And so in the Civic Bargain, we're talking about the collision of opinions, right? And what happens though when it's a collision of facts?
Yeah, misinformation. I mean, this is really, once again, a terrible problem. I mean, social media generates a lot of just lies. Lies, half-truths, absolute falsities, and a lot of the people using it don't have any meaningful way to sort through that. Once again, one of the really serious problems. They sound like a stuck record, but the only answer I can come up with is that we push back with a program of civic education that says truth matters. Right? It really is important that you learn to test arguments, that you not just get all of your evidence about the world from one set of clearly, partisan media. You ought to be. So if we can teach people to do that, then we will have at least begun to push back. I don't know of any other way to do it. If we have free speech, you can't ban lying, right? You can't simply ban falsity if you're really committed to free speech. And so the only way I know is to combat misinformation with good information. And that means that not just at universities, but at K-12, as a citizenship, we have to be committed to truth rather than falsity. So, is it going to work? I don't know. Will we enter into a world if we don't do anything? Will it get worse? And will mendacity simply become the, misinformation, lies are just as real as truth? I worry that we could. So this is, once again, it's trying to do what we can where we are, and just basically saying that, yeah, truth does matter, and that we in universities are in the truth business. Yes, please.
Thank you for bringing us back to Aristotle and civic friendship. When I'm thinking about what makes civic friends work well, part of it is that you're entering into a pact where you are willing to shoulder some of the losses, and in turn, someone will do so the next time, either personally or your group that you might belong to. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how to reconcile that kind of objective or aim in a context where it's very much about competition and I want to win personally. How do we encourage that sort of trust and pact building among citizens so that they learn to shoulder losses and not just be looking out for their own gains?
Yeah, no, absolutely great. So how do we encourage civic friendship? How do we get people away from the zero-sum win-lose mentality towards a bargain that actually you have? Both sides are better off in the bargain than outside the bargain. So what I sometimes say to this kind of worry is that it's actually very straightforward and it's very understandable. Imagine you are going to buy a used car, right? This works well with students because they have to sometimes buy used cars. So you're going to buy a used car. What's your optimum outcome? You get the car you want for free. The salesman just gives it to you. And what's the salesman's optimal outcome? This person comes in with a wad of money, and they just give the salesman the money, and the salesman keeps the car. Now, do either side in that does that even occur to the salesman or the person buying the car? Is that an outcome they can conceive of? I get everything and you get nothing. No, of course not. You're there to have a negotiation about how much car can I get for as little money as I can, or how much money can I get for as little car as I can. And you're going to come to some agreement, and bargaining strength is going to have some part in it. But if you make the deal and neither side has lied, right? So it's a contract that's actually an honest contract. Then you'll both walk out better off than you were before. You wanted the car more than you wanted the money that you gave. The salesman wanted the money that you gave more than the car. So it's what we do all the time. right? This is how we live our lives in commercial society, at least in a market economy. And all we have to really do is say, that's the way that politics works too. Politics seems like it's so much higher stakes, and sure it is, than getting a car, but the logic is the same. We're engaged in a negotiation in which neither side will get everything they want, but both are better off inside the bargain than outside the bargain. So my hope is that this isn't the only analogy we can use, it's not the only way we can do it, but it's not so hard to think through. There are ways in which we day to day engage in basically positive sum bargains. There's no dangerous about calling it win-win bargains, because that's wrong actually. We don't both win in the sense we get everything we want. It's not like we win in the sense that you win a football game, say, but we're both better off than we would be if we hadn't made the agreement and stuck to it. So that's my hope, is that we can basically say that this is not some highly specialized way of thinking about things. You don't have to be deeply altruistic to engage in this. You don't have to basically develop a kind of a virtue that is so great that it is very rare and hard to develop. We all do this all the time. We just need to learn again how to do this when we're talking with our fellow citizens.